The Unknown Bridesmaid by Margaret Forster. Read by Sian Thomas. Chapter 1. Julia gave the child the doll and waited. There was a toy cradle in the room and a toy pram, the old-fashioned sort, not a buggy. Beside the cradle and the pram was a neat pile of miniature blankets and sheets and pillows. No duvets. Julia made a mental note to include a duvet in the choice of bed linen. Most children today would be used to duvets, not sheets and blankets. Sheets and blankets might confuse them. The child, a girl of 8, small for her age, thin and quite frail-looking, though she had been examined and pronounced perfectly healthy, held the doll in both hands, gripping it round its shoulders. She looked at it without any apparent interest. It was a baby doll, with a bald head and blue eyes, which could close if the doll was tilted in a certain way. It was dressed in a baby grow, a blue one, and underneath it wore a paper nappy. After a minute or so, the girl looked up at Julia and frowned. She put the doll down and folded her arms. Quietly, without speaking, Julia picked the doll up and gave it a cuddle, patting it on its back as though it were a real baby. Then she went to the toy pram and put the doll into it. The girl began to show some interest, but this interest was more in Julia's action than in doll or pram. Carefully, Julia tucked the sheets and blankets round the doll until only its head, with its closed eyes, was visible. Then she pushed the pram backwards and forwards, edging it nearer and nearer to the girl, and then finally letting it come to rest beside her. The girl immediately pushed the pram away, quite violently. Julia was 8 when the invitation to be a bridesmaid came from her cousin Iris. It was a great surprise to Julia's mother, as well as to Julia herself. Iris's mother and Julia's mother were sisters, but they were not close. Julia's mother had always felt that Maureen, her older sister, treated her with disdain. She'd felt this all her life, and so had been happy, once she had married and moved away from Manchester, where they were both born, to keep her distance. But a wedding changed things. Julia's mother understood that her sister would want the gathering together of her family, if just to match the gathering on the bridegroom's side. The bridegroom was a major in the army, and his father was an MP. Maureen couldn't match that, but she could at least have her sister and niece at her side. But, though she understood this, Julia's mother did not immediately accept the invitation for Julia to be a bridesmaid. She waited 3 days, and then she rang her sister up saying she doubted whether Julia could accept because of the expense involved. There would be the dress, the shoes, the flowers, and she had no money to spare for any of those things. She reminded her sister that she was a widow on a very small pension. Her sister was furious, but she tried to keep the anger at Julia's mother boasting of her poverty, which is how she regarded it, out of her voice. She reminded herself that her sister had had a hard time, and was indeed quite poor, whereas she herself was comparatively well off, and ought to be magnanimous. She said her sister was not to worry about the expense. She said that, of course, she would pay for Julia's outfit and everything that went with it. She had always intended to, and should have made this clear. If Julia's measurements were sent, a dress would be made and shoes bought. Julia's mother still made a fuss about expense. She and Julia were to stay with Maureen, so the cost of a hotel was not involved, but a train ticket to Manchester would be pricey. Then there was the expense of getting to the station in the first place. The buses from the village were rare and at awkward times, so a taxi would be needed. On and on Julia's mother went, moaning about money, doing sums on scraps of paper, looking in her bank book and emptying loose change out of various tin boxes marked gas and rent. Julia, always a good and obedient child, held her breath and waited. Meanwhile, a swatch of material arrived in the post, sent by Maureen to show Julia the colour and texture of the dress being made for her. It was not pink. That was the first disappointment. Julia had always assumed the dress would be pink. Instead, it was not exactly white, but a kind of cream, and it was not soft or silky. This scrap of material felt like cotton, or even— "Good heavens," said Julia's mother. "Rayon."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?